To enjoy this episode ad-free, please visit patreon.com/forensic tales.
Forensic Tales discusses topics that some listeners may find disturbing. The contents of this episode may not be suitable for everyone. Listener discretion is advised.
It was supposed to be a normal night for 78-year-old Shirley Ramey and her husband of 57 years, Daryl, from Hope, Idaho. Daryl went to go play cards with friends while Shirley stayed inside at their quiet home near the Canadian border. But when Daryl returned home that evening with a bacon cheeseburger she had asked for, he found the sliding glass door open and Shirley lying on the floor in a pool of blood. His wife of nearly 6 decades had been shot twice at close range. But just when the police thought they had everything figured out, the case went ice cold. Who would want a 78-year-old wife, mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother dead? This is Forensic Tales, episode 324, The Murder of Shirley Ramey. Welcome to Forensic Tales. I'm your host, Courtney Fretwell. Forensic Tales is a weekly crime podcast with a forensic twist. Each episode features real stories highlighting how forensic science was used to uncover the truth. If you enjoy deep dives into real cases and the science behind them, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss an episode. And if you want even more content, including monthly bonus episodes and behind-the-scenes updates, you can join our community over on Patreon. The support there truly helps keep this show going. To learn more, visit patreon.com/forensic tales. Please consider leaving a positive review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It really helps other listeners discover the podcast. Let's get into today's case. Close to the border of the United States and Canada, Hope, Idaho, probably isn't a place you're familiar with. But any of the 100 people who live there will likely tell you it's the most beautiful spot on Earth. Many years ago, the Northern Pacific Railroad built Highland House in Hope as a luxury hotel for people coming from the East. But today, it's just a nice, quiet place to live, retire, or raise a family. Most people would agree that, generally speaking, Idaho has a low crime rate, but sometimes small towns can experience isolated, serious crimes, and the town of Hope isn't any different. And the case we're about to cover in this episode is arguably one of the worst crimes this town has ever seen. It's a crime that still haunts residents even after almost a decade. But thankfully, advancements in forensic science helped to catch a killer who targeted a sweet grandmother without an enemy in the world. In 2017, Shirley and Daryl Ramey were two of about 100 people who called Hope, Idaho, home. And by all accounts, they were just your unassuming all-American couple. Their relationship started like a fairy tale. Daryl would tell the TV show, Forensic Files, that he met Shirley when they were just a couple of young teenagers. One day, while at work, one of his friends told him about a local dance that was happening later that night. And when they showed up, Daryl said the first person to catch his attention was Shirley. Even after all these years, he still says she was the most beautiful woman at this dance. After that night, the rest was history, as they say. They dated for about 9 months and got married in May of 1960. But that was just the start of their lives together. Throughout their nearly 60-year marriage, they raised 2 sons, Kenneth and Todd, and would eventually become grandparents and great-grandparents. Honestly, they lived the kind of life a lot of us can only dream about. For most of Shirley's life, she worked as Hope's city clerk. In fact, She held that position for over 25 years, and she loved the job so much that she never missed a council meeting, even while battling cancer. But her long-standing career and big family weren't her only passions. She also loved the outdoors, was an avid gardener, and a member of the local garden club. If you lived in Hope, you would often see her around town sporting hats and scarves while lunching with the Red Hat Society. Now, you're probably asking yourself the same question I asked myself while researching this case. Who would want someone like Shirley dead? On the afternoon of April 4th, 2017, Daryl went into town to play cards with old friends at the local senior center. But before he headed out the door, he asked Shirley what she wanted for dinner. It was a Friday night, and they usually went out to eat. But because he had plans, Shirley asked if he could pick up a bacon cheeseburger on his way home after the card game. So after the game wrapped up, Daryl went to the restaurant next door and got Shirley her burger, then headed straight home. But when he got there around 5 p.m., he saw that the sliding glass door was wide open. He thought this was strange because it was a little chilly that night, so he wondered why Shirley would leave the door open. But as he stepped inside, he very quickly realized why. Right there on the living room floor, he would see Shirley lying in a pool of her own blood. He immediately dropped the cheeseburger and ran to the phone to call for help. But by the time police and paramedics arrived at the remote house, there was nothing they could do. 78-year-old Shirley was already dead. When the police first arrived, they weren't exactly sure what they were walking into. Given Shirley's age, it wouldn't be unheard of to respond to a sudden or unexpected death. Maybe she had a catastrophic fall. Maybe there was some type of accident. But that's definitely not what they walked into. Not only was Shirley dead, but she had been shot twice at nearly point-blank range. Someone had entered the home, looked her in the face, pulled out a gun, and shot her without any hesitation. If that detail isn't chilling enough, just wait for this. Almost nothing at the crime scene made any sense. It just didn't look like your typical shooting. Number 1, the police found no obvious signs of forced entry. Besides the sliding glass door being open, there weren't any signs of a break-in. No broken windows. No broken locks. It was like Shirley just let her killer inside. And number 2, nothing valuable had been taken or stolen from the house. Except for an old hunting rifle, nothing was missing, and nothing seemed out of place. If this were a robbery or home invasion, there should have been obvious items stolen from the house. Or the house would have looked completely ransacked. But the police didn't see any of that. It was like this was a murder with no apparent motive. And going back to the question I raised just a moment ago, who could possibly have a reason to carry out an execution-style killing on a 78-year-old great-grandmother who was home by herself? When it came to suspects, detectives started by looking at those closest to Shirley. I say this in almost every episode, but we all know we're far more likely to be killed by someone we know rather than a complete stranger. And given the lack of forced entry and absence of a struggle, it seemed very possible that Shirley knew her killer. So the police focused on her inner circle, including her husband Daryl. But pretty quickly, they found that to be a dead end. Detectives were able to verify Daryl's alibi about playing cards with friends in town that night. He never left and went straight home after picking up dinner, so he was quickly crossed off the suspect list. But he wasn't the only person from Shirley's inner circle they considered. The police also wondered whether it could have been one of the neighbors or another Hope resident. Only about 100 people lived there, so any one of them could be a possible suspect. But given what the police knew about her, Shirley just didn't have a single enemy. By all accounts, she was a very well-liked woman in the community, And when it came to the neighbors, there wasn't anyone who immediately stood out. And to be honest, the couple didn't really have many neighbors. Shirley and Daryl lived on Trestle Creek Road, a place only accessible for part of the year by car. During the winter and into the early part of spring, you can only get to the front door by snowmobile. So this is a very rural and isolated area. Plus, when it came to the neighbors, Shirley had only a few within a handful of miles. There just aren't a lot of people who live up in the canyon. But the remoteness actually worked in the police's favor. While searching the area around the outside of the house for clues, investigators noticed a set of footprints leading away from the home. And since this property saw so little human traffic, the police felt confident these shoe prints were left by the killer. In fact, some of the police officers from this area even joke that northern Idaho has more than 4 seasons, and one of them is mud season. But unfortunately for them, the ground was too wet and they weren't able to take any molds. But that didn't mean they couldn't follow them. The footprints began at Shirley's house and continued for about half a mile, leading investigators to a small camper trailer. At the time, a transient man named Nathan Ott was living there. He was 41 years old. But the trailer itself wasn't anything most people would want to live in. It didn't have running water, and it didn't have electricity. That said, detectives didn't immediately find that unusual. In parts of northern Idaho, living off the grid isn't unheard of. Some people choose to live that way. But something else about the trailer immediately caught their attention. As officers approached, they noticed several bullet holes punched through the side of it. It looked as though someone had fired multiple shots at the trailer from the outside. And investigators were able to determine that every one of those shots had been fired from the roadway. And that still wasn't even the most unusual part of what they were about to discover. Trajectory analysis and standard ballistic tests would later show that these bullet holes were fresh. And not only were they fresh, but they were made right around the same exact time Shirley was shot and killed. Right next to the trailer, detectives found 2 shell casings from a 9mm handgun, and that discovery was yet another red flag. Because back inside Shirley's house, investigators had already found 2 shell casings just feet from her body. Those casings had also been fired from a 9mm semi-automatic handgun. When detectives looked at them even closer, they noticed something else. All 4 shell casings carried the same manufacturer's stamp, RP for Remington Peters. So it became obvious pretty quickly that the same gun that had been used to kill Shirley had also been fired into Nathan Ott's trailer nearly half a mile away. Nathan Ott was no stranger to law enforcement. He had several run-ins with the police over the years. So when his name popped up in this investigation, most of the detectives on the force already knew him. He also suffered from schizophrenia and had a record of stalking and harassing people. Nathan, who was hearing impaired, wasn't at his trailer on April 4th, 2017, but someone had been there recently, and that someone had apparently fired a gun. And even though he had no prior contact with Shirley and didn't own a gun, the police knew he had access to one. Here's how they knew that. When investigators spoke with some of Nathan's friends, they said he was present when some of his friends had come to his trailer and were shooting a 9mm. But none of this was solid evidence of Nathan's guilt in Shirley's murder. Not yet, anyway. Several weeks later, the police got a phone call from Nathan's brother, and what he had to say completely changed what they thought about Shirley's neighbor, Nathan. After this phone call, he quickly rose to the top of the suspect list. The brother told police that he had been at a bar with Nathan and a few friends a few days after Shirley's murder. And while they were all hanging out at this bar, Nathan talked about killing or shooting people. Nathan didn't come right out and say that because he's deaf, but according to the brother, he made physical gestures about shooting and killing someone. Nathan's communication was largely sign language, so when the brother saw this, he interpreted that as Nathan saying he shot someone. Of course, this story piqued the investigators' attention, but they needed to verify his story. So a few officers went to the bar he said they were at. And sure enough, they were able to pull up the restaurant's security camera footage that captured Nathan making the shooting gestures. So this seemed to verify the brother's story that he may have confessed to the shooting. This all happened just days after Shirley had been gunned down. It also made sense because Nathan was the closest person physically to Shirley. His trailer was only about a half-mile away. So the theory was that after shooting and killing Shirley inside her home, he walked back to his trailer in the mud, leaving behind the shoe prints. And when he got home, he shot into his own trailer using the same 9mm for some reason. So after the phone call with the brother, investigators in Bonner County spent the next several weeks looking for 41-year-old Nathan Ott. He was considered armed and dangerous, and the urgency to find him was very, very high. It was also suspicious that he seemed to have skipped town after the murder. So the media all over the Pacific Northwest were given his description and told to be on the lookout. And that strategy of getting the public involved seemed to work, because within just a few days of the media attention, they found him. Nathan was picked up by the U.S. Marshals after someone called police to report that he was boarding an Amtrak train from Portland, Oregon, heading toward Idaho. And as soon as Nathan got off the train in Idaho, he was picked up and arrested. But what exactly was he doing in Portland, Oregon? Didn't he know almost the entire country was out looking for him? Nathan told detectives that he was returning home after checking himself into a mental health facility in Oregon. So he had no idea he was wanted or under police investigation. He also said he had nothing to do with Shirley's murder and could prove it. He claimed that numerous people had seen him around the time she was killed, so it would have been impossible for him to be in two places at once. After that, the case against Nathan Ott completely fell apart. Detectives were able to verify his alibi and confirmed he was nowhere near Shirley's property on the night of the murder. And within an hour of his arrest, he was released from custody. Nathan was totally and completely innocent. He was just a guy who liked to live in a small trailer without electricity. He liked to live off the grid and had no idea who fired those 2 shots into his property. When the case against Shirley's neighbor fell apart, the investigation turned cold. Like I mentioned at the top of the episode, she just didn't have any enemies. And since this wasn't a robbery, it was really hard for investigators to pinpoint a motive. And without a motive, it's even harder to find and identify suspects. The only clues investigators seemed to have were, number 1, the family's missing hunting rifle. Number 2, the shoe prints in the mud leading away from the house. And number 3, the 2 spent 9mm casings found near Shirley's body. So all these clues told detectives a few things. The killer wanted to take something from the house without turning it into a full-blown robbery. They walked away from the crime scene on foot, and they owned a 9mm handgun. The police also knew the killer fired 2 shots into Nathan's trailer a half-mile away for some unknown reason. But although the case was turning cold, it was impossible for anyone in this part of Idaho to forget. We've covered a lot of heartbreaking stories just on this podcast alone. Each and every year, there are so many victims of violent crimes. But there was something about this case that really stuck with Idaho residents. This was a grandmother, This was someone who was just at home by herself on a Friday night while her husband played cards at the local senior citizen center. This was such a motiveless and senseless murder. So this was just a crime that really stuck with people. Shirley's brutal and unexplained murder eventually caught the attention of ATF agent James Butler, who thought maybe they could help. Typically, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives isn't in the business of solving homicides, especially cold ones from the Pacific Northwest. But they definitely have the resources to help other law enforcement agencies that handle these types of cases. Here's why they got involved. In 2017, almost 8 in 10 of the murders committed in the United States involved a firearm, and all those guns and bullets used in them are rich sources of forensic evidence. So here's why this federal agent thought they could maybe help in Shirley's case. The ATF's National Integrated Ballistic Information Network uses a machine called brass tracks to take three-dimensional scans of the millions of brass cartridge casings recovered from crime scenes or from confiscated weapons that were later test-fired. It's those images that allow police from all over the country to compare markings from one crime scene to the next very, very quickly. To give you an idea of how quickly this technology works, investigators can collect shell casings from a shooting scene and, within just 24 to 48 hours, determine whether the gun that fired them has been linked to any other casings already entered into the system. And this technology isn't just limited to certain police departments. Any agency, whether it's federal, state, local, or tribal, can work with the ATF to compare bullet casings. So, when it came to Shirley's case, the police in Idaho, along with this federal agent, sent the two casings to be entered into the national system. And while they waited for the results, everyone was on pins and needles. They knew those two bullet casings had the power to bring this family justice. But the results weren't what anyone had hoped for. There weren't any matches in the database. This was very disappointing for investigators and Shirley's family, but it wasn't the end of the road. In fact, it was the exact opposite. This search is what led the authorities straight to Shirley's killer's front door. Once he learned there were no matches in the database, federal agent James Butler decided to take a chance and go a different direction. He reached out to several different law enforcement agencies around the City of Hope and asked if they had any Glock 9mm guns that had been used in a crime but hadn't been test-fired yet. He didn't tell any of these agencies why or what he needed the information for. He just kept the line of communication open. But this creative idea didn't immediately turn up any new leads or information. In reality, this went on for months. And during that time, not a single tip came in about Shirley's case. It was ice cold. But then, several months later, Agent Butler got a tip that would prove to be gold. He received a phone call from police officers 100 miles away in Lincoln County, Montana, about a Glock 9mm they had sitting inside their evidence locker, a gun that had been picked up just hours after Shirley was gunned down. The gun belonged to a 57-year-old woman named Judith Carpenter. She used the gun to threaten a couple during a road rage incident in Libby, Montana. This incident happened just hours after Shirley was killed that night. Libby police officers were called to the scene, and Judith was arrested for aggravated assault. You can't just pull out a gun and threaten someone because you're mad at how they're driving. So Judith was arrested, and the police confiscated the gun. But the 9mm wasn't the only one police officers found in her car. They also collected an old hunting rifle that was found sitting in the back seat. Initially, Libby police officers were confused. Why would this woman be packing such heat? Why did Judith feel like she needed to have two separate weapons inside her car, especially the hunting rifle? When Judith was questioned by police officers, she said she was driving on Highway 200 when she decided to pull over so she could urinate on the side of the road. And when she pulled off the highway, that's when she said she found the rifle on the side of the road. But this story just didn't make sense. What are the odds there's a random hunting rifle just sitting on the side of the highway? So the police kept questioning her, and as they were speaking to her, the police thought Judith just seemed very uncomfortable. She seemed almost paranoid. So in the back of the officer's mind was, why is this woman so nervous? If she just found this rifle on the side of the road, why is she acting so paranoid? What does this woman have to hide? This bizarre interview with Judith Carpenter happened the same day as Shirley's murder. But the police in North Idaho had absolutely no idea. And the police in Montana had no reason to suspect Judith might have been involved in anything other than a road rage incident. Judith was ultimately booked and placed in jail for aggravated assault charges. And it was clear to the police pretty early on that she suffered from mental health issues. So as soon as she was booked in jail, she underwent a court-ordered mental health evaluation. And for the next several weeks, she received treatment and was ultimately released. But upon her release, Judith wasn't allowed to take all of her property with her. The 9mm Glock was ordered to stay in the police's custody. Several months later, the gun was test-fired and entered into the national database. And that's when police in Idaho investigating Shirley's murder got the break they needed. The gun was a perfect match. But now that investigators know that Judith's gun was used in Shirley's murder, the next question on everyone's minds is why? If the forensic evidence is true, why would Judith Carpenter murder an innocent old woman inside her home in rural Idaho one random Friday night? The best theory investigators came up with was that in the midst of a full-blown mental crisis, Judith had been driving hundreds of miles that day and had to go to the bathroom. And that's when she stumbled upon Shirley's front door. The police believed she knocked on the door and asked if she could use the bathroom. But Shirley refused to let her inside. She was all alone. Her husband was in town playing cards with friends. And she had no idea who this woman was. And that's when the police suspect Judith pulled out her Glock and fatally shot her twice at point-blank range. This theory seemed to answer a lot of the unanswered questions the police had. It explained why there weren't any signs of forced entry. Judith simply knocked on the front door, and when Shirley didn't let her use the bathroom, she shot her to death. And it also explained why Shirley's old hunting rifle was missing. That was eventually found in Judith's back seat after she was arrested for the road rage incident. It's just unclear why she decided to steal it in the first place. As she was driving away from Shirley's place, for some unknown reason, she decided to fire 2 shots into Nathan's trailer. Then 4 hours later, she was arrested in Montana for the road rage incident for pulling a gun on a random couple. Ultimately, the forensic evidence caught a killer. Idaho State forensic scientist Stuart Johnson completed an exam of Judith's Glock and confirmed the shell casings recovered at Shirley's murder scene were fired from her gun. Judith Carpenter had killed Shirley Ramey on April 4th, 2017. At her preliminary hearing in Sandpoint in October of 2019, the judge transferred the case over to the Bonner County District Court, where the trial was scheduled to be held. Initially, Judith Carpenter was charged with first-degree murder. Although the killing appeared random, the facts of the crime warranted first-degree murder charges. According to testimony from this preliminary hearing, Judith had called the police earlier that day of the murder to report someone breaking into her home. Cell phone records placed her in the town of Sagal about 30 minutes to an hour before the murder. This is a town about 20 miles away from Shirley's home in Hope, Idaho. The deputy who arrested her in Montana testified that she seemed, quote, delusional, and claimed someone stole her identity while trying to enter Canada. Probably the most heartbreaking part of the hearing was when Shirley's husband, Daryl, spoke about what it was like to find his wife dead like that. You just can't imagine what that would be like. Not only do you lose your wife of so many years, but to also lose her in such a senseless and violent way is just unimaginable. He also said they had never met Judith Carpenter before, so this was a completely random killing. The hearing ended by prosecutors agreeing with him. They argued that Judith Carpenter simply wanted to shoot someone that day. Quote, Carpenter wanted to shoot things and she wanted to shoot people, said the prosecutor during closing arguments. But the case against her never made it to trial. Like in so many other criminal cases, Judith Carpenter accepted a plea deal. In June 2021, 59-year-old Judith Marie Carpenter pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. When asked about why she did this, she simply said she didn't remember. Judge Barbara Buchanan, who presided over the case, said that she didn't think the murder was premeditated, but still willfully and deliberately done. Here's a direct quote from her about what she thought of the plea deal. Quote, I think this agreed sentence is the absolute best way for this case to be resolved for everyone. I wish that our system had better resolution for mental health. It is something that we see so much of in the courts. End quote. At the plea hearing, we got to hear directly from Judith. Here's part of her statement to Daryl. I want to apologize for your loss of someone so special, a partner, a wife, a mom, and a grandma. My family lost the same. I really am sorry about your loss. End quote. She also said part of her decision to accept the plea deal was to spare Shirley's family the trauma of going to trial. Very little has been made public about who exactly Judith Carpenter is, but here's everything I could find. She had been a licensed cosmetologist in the state of Idaho since 1991, and later became a licensed real estate appraiser in 2005. State records show that she even ran her own appraisal business out of the West Prairie Shopping Center in Hayden. To the people who lived around her, the idea that she could be connected to a crime like this was shocking. Judith Carpenter had lived in the same home on West Elm Grove Court for nearly 20 years. Neighbors described her as somewhat of a friendly introvert, someone who mostly kept to herself. They said her grandchildren were often visiting the house, and she could frequently be seen outside working in the yard, mowing the lawn, or recently rebuilding a stone retaining wall. One neighbor across the street, Les Gerloff, described Judith and the man she lived with as, quote, totally normal, wonderful people. Another neighbor, Elizabeth Barker, had only lived next door for about a month. She said she had spoken with Judith just a couple of times, mostly about things neighbors tend to talk about, like overgrown trees or a fence that had accidentally been built a few inches over the property line. But even from those brief interactions, Barker said she seemed, quote, really very nice. She had heard that Judith may have had some disagreements with a previous neighbor, but in her own experience, their interactions had always been friendly. So you can only imagine the look of shock on the neighbors' faces after seeing her arrested for something like this. Nothing will ever bring Shirley back to her husband, children, grandchildren, or great-grandchildren. What happened to her that spring day in 2017 is unimaginable and senseless. No one deserves to have their life taken in such a horrible way, and for many months, the killer in this case almost walked free. But thanks to new forensic technology and just good old-fashioned detective work, the person responsible for the crime has been brought to justice. But is there closure in a case like this? There might be justice because a criminal is behind bars thanks to forensic science. But the question surrounding closure is far more complicated. Is there ever really closure when something like this happens? Shirley's family held a memorial service following her death and publicly thanks the Bonner County Emergency Medical Services and the Sheriff's Department for their kind and loving care during this difficult time. They also asked that a memorial be made to the Hope Center community in Hope, Idaho, in her memory. To share your thoughts on this week's episode, be sure to follow us on Instagram and Facebook. And if you want to listen to next week's story early and ad-free, consider joining the show's Patreon page at patreon.com/Forensic Tales. Thank you so much for listening. Until next week, remember, not all stories have happy endings. Forensic Tales is a Rockefeller audio production. The show is written and produced by me, Courtney Fretwell. If you'd like to support the show and help fund research, production, and editing, you can do so with a small monthly contribution on Patreon. Patreon supporters get early access to ad-free episodes and exclusive bonus content. Thank you so much to this week's newest supporter, Teresa Z. You can learn more at patreon.com/Forensic Tales. And if you enjoy the show, leaving a positive rating or review really helps others discover it. For a full list of sources used in this episode, visit forensictales.com. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next week. Until then, remember, not all stories have happy endings.